Hey everyone, welcome to the last part of the tutorial where we are going to go over the index.js file, which is the interface of this decentralized application. So we're going to understand how we are creating these buttons, input fields, checkboxes, and connecting to our MetaMask wallet in order to sign transactions and also pull data from the blockchain, right? Search, or sign. All right. So I would recommend going into the GitHub link under the video. It will be a lot easier to follow along, and just click on the link, and you'll see that this is the repo of the whole project. The file that we will review is in the pages folder index.js. Here it is. Now online, it's using zkEVM, which is what I did throughout the whole video, the whole tutorial series. In this video, I'm using the Sepolia network because I've been having some issues with zkEVM today. So only for now, it's with Sepolia, but you should stick to zkEVM testnet since it should be working in a couple of hours. Okay, one last thing is I am not going to show the deployment of the application online because it's fairly simple. It's only 4 steps in the README file of this repository, and I've shown this in multiple videos before. So you can just click on the video above and see an example of how to do this on vercel with a different decentralized application. All right, so let's get started with our index file. So at the top, we're just importing the modules and libraries that we're going to use. Here, we're declaring a few variables, or use states, because we're going to use most of these variables inside the functions that we call that are based on our smart contract, right? This, if you haven't seen this, I would highly recommend you go to the first tutorial video where we build the smart contract out together. All right. So the first thing that's probably happening when we are loading the page, or soon after the page is loaded, we're going this line 51. We have a function that we built here called initialize web3 model, and we're connecting to the Sepolia network, and we're saying if the wallet is not connected, if wallet connected is false, which it is because we did not connect the wallet yet, initial value is false, then initialize web3 modal function. So we're doing all of this, and then trigger the connect wallet function, which is right here on line 25, right? We're connecting to the wallet, doing the get provider or signer function. It's like functions within functions. Connecting to the Sepolia network. This is the Sepolia chain ID, and then and that's it. And then once this is connected, once the wallet is connected, you'll see here in the last part where we on line 66 where we render the button, we say if wallet connected true, then just return connected. As you can see here, connected. Let's try to refresh. Now we have to connect our wallet. So it says it's connect your wallet. See how it says here, connect your wallet. If this is false, then return a button that says connect your wallet, right? So we're going to say connect your wallet, and we will put the password in here, Sepolia network. And now that the wallet is connected, we see that the button says connected, right? So this is the first 4 functions of up until line 80 of the decentralized application. And what's cool about this is you don't really have to change anything. When you create a new decentralized application for a new contract, these first 4 functions can stay the same. You don't need to change anything. Change it to zkEVM testnet if that's what you want. But you can just copy paste for every future contract that you have. All right, so let's go to the meat of it. Now we're going to create a function that is called newShelter. Now newShelter is going to call the addShelter function of the smart contract, right? You see here in the smart contract, we have an addShelter function on line 87. This function right here, so it's going to call this function. But before we call that, let's see what's happening. We're going to call this function a newShelter, and if we look for this, we'll see that newShelter down here where we return everything, where we display everything on the page, we see that the newShelter is part of this button, right? That says submit right under the shelter zip code. So if we go here, we'll see shelter zip code, and then we have this button. So the button says submit, and whenever we click on it, on a click, it's going to activate or execute this function, newShelter function. So let's go to the newShelter function, and we see that what we're going to try here from line 82 to 96, we're getting the provider or signer, and we'll say true because we want the signer, and we'll start. We'll instantiate. We'll create an instance of our contract with the signer. So now we'll get like the MetaMask or the wallet, the user's wallet's private ID, and all the information that we need to sign a transaction. And we'll set the loading to true, so the button says loading ... And then we'll call the addShelter function. And we'll take here 4 different input arguments, because we see in the smart contract that we only take 4 different input arguments. They're all strings: name, country, city, and zip code. So shelter name, if we want to look for it, we'll see that this comes from right here. This comes from on line 321. Shelter name is the input field, right? Let's go to the shelter name input field. You see here shelter name, it's this input field. And we say that whenever we change the input field, then it's going to update the shelter name variable. And this is going to be the new value will be of the input field will be the shelter name. All right, so if you go all the way up, you see here set shelter name right here. At the beginning it's nothing, empty string, but then it will be, we'll set the shelter name according to the input, whatever the input is. Shelter 2. This is now shelter 2 right here. Shelter 2. Okay, so we have shelter name, we have same thing as country, city, and zip code. All of these are input fields, and then we wait for the transaction to execute. We set the loading to false, so the button disappears and becomes submit again, and that is it. So let's see how this works. Let's put a newShelter in there. Let's put country, I don't know, Ecuador. City, Quito. And then zip code, we'll say 98HU, whatever that zip code is. Submit. Connect to our wallet. We have to approve the transaction, confirm. We are the signers. Now it's going to take a few seconds. Usually takes about 10 seconds or so on this network. And so it's executing. You see right now the button is still true. Set loading is true. So we see here loading. And now we get this alert. Now look at this alert. It says, thank you for adding your shelter. Your shelter ID is 2. Please save this ID for future reference. Right? And why is it giving us this alert? Because of 2 reasons. First of all, in the smart contract, we see that when this function is executed, it creates the shelter struct. So it inputs data onto the blockchain of a newShelter with all this information that we input in there, with capacity false and is deleted false, and it also emits the shelter added event, right? The event that we have at the very beginning. It emits this event. So we're going to make use of this event to create this ID, this alert message. And this is how we do it here. Go back to your index file. We can close newShelter. And we'll say use effect on 182. This create browser alert with shelter ID when newShelter is added. So this is just going to listen to events on the page. And we're going to say on the shelter contract, call this the shelter added event, extract the ID, convert it to a string. You see ID is an actual variable, right? The shelter ID. So extract the ID, and then return this ID in this message. Thank you for adding your shelter. Your shelter ID is blah 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 blah. Shelter ID is da da da. So this is how we create our alert. Let's close this, and now let's click OK. And now let's look at our second function that inserts data into the database, into the blockchain. And this is allowing the shelter to update the capacity of their shelter. Because initially, the capacity is, you can see from the shelter smart contract, initially the capacity is false. When you add a new shelter, I'm assuming you're not at full capacity because you just started your shelter, so it's at false. So I want to allow the user, the shelter owner, to update the capacity. So I'm going to create a new function here called newCapacity, which is tied to our button. Let's go to a button all the way down there, down here. newCapacity, this is a button right under my shelter ID, right? My shelter ID, we have a button, submit, and this button, when we click on it, is going to trigger the newCapacity function. So this newCapacity function will pull the signer again. Again, we need a signer. This is true because we need a wallet signer because the user is going to update the capacity of their shelter, which is a transaction on the blockchain, right? It's going to cost them some gas, so they have to approve the transaction. Signer, we're just printing out the shelter capacity, so we'll see what let's see what it says. And then we're going to use the update shelter capacity. This is about, we're going to call this function. Remember, this is on top of the shelter contract. So it's on the shelter contract, update shelter capacity right here. And shelter capacity takes two input arguments, a number and a Boolean, right? Shelter ID and the newCapacity. So we're taking shelter ID and shelter capacity. Where is this coming from? Control C, Control F. And you'll see this is coming from down here. Shelter ID is part of the input field, right? My shelter ID, input field. Let's go to input field, my shelter ID, right? And whatever you put in here, when we change this, it's going to update the shelter ID variable, right? So that is why we're getting the shelter ID variable from the input field. We're getting the shelter capacity, if it's true or false, from the checkbox right here. Let's look at the shelter capacity right down here. So this is a checkbox, input type checkbox, and whenever we change the checkbox, it's going to update the shelter capacity variable, which is all the way on the top. Shelter capacity from true or false, right? It's a Boolean. So we're going to update this to true or false, and then we will send the alert shelter capacity updated. So let's assume beginning shelter ID was 1. This is the shelter ID 2 was the shelter ID 2, and the capacity was false. Let's update it to true. Submit. Approve the transaction. Give it a few seconds, and we will see that now we'll get this alert saying shelter capacity updated. Shelter capacity updated, okay, and we can see it worked because when we pull shelter ID number 2, we'll see capacity true, and before it was false. And what's cool about this is you only have to provide the input arguments for the smart contracts function, right? Update shelter capacity, these two input arguments. The smart contract that lives on the virtual machine is going to do all the rest. It's going to check if it's the right. Remember these modifiers from tutorial number 1. It's going to check if you are the shelter owner, if you deleted this shelter, and if the shelter ID exists, and then it's going to update the shelter struct. Right. So you don't need to do any of this on the front end. You just provide the 2 input fields. And if for example this is a modifier only exists in shelter, if we try to put a shelter that doesn't exist, number 3, you'll get this error in processing your request to update capacity because this is not your shelter ID. This doesn't even exist. Okay. Now, let's go to the last 2 functions, and these are to some degree simpler in a sense that you don't insert data to the blockchain. So you don't need a signer. You're just pulling data from the blockchain. So you don't need to connect to the signer's wallet. You just want to pull data. In this case, the user will put the ID of the shelter they wanna pull. They can pull their shelter. I just created number 2, or they can pull somebody else's shelter and see some data about that shelter. So let's close this newCapacity, and let's go into line 141, getMyShelter. So in getMyShelter, again, we only need a provider, and then we build a contract instance, and then we will call this function that from the contract, the getShelterListing, and we'll include this input argument, shelter ID number 2. GetShelterListing, if you go to the smart contract, getShelterListing is right here, line 116. And what it does, you take the input argument, you take a shelter ID, and then it will return that specific shelter. Because this is the mapping, remember? Shelter listings, shelter ID, let's say 1. So what it does, it goes to the mapping of shelter listings, puts number 1, shelter ID, and then it will return this specific shelter, right? That's tied to shelter ID number 1. So we'll return this struct of shelter ID number 1. Returns all this information. I want to put this information a little bit cleaner, so I'm creating a dictionary. The first item of this shelter struct is going to be called shelter name, then shelter country, and the last item will be called is deleted. Again, you can see you want to do this console. Always try to print things out and see what you get, because this could teach you a lot of good, give you a lot of good information and help you understand what's happening. Extract data. So let's see what's happening here. We're going to get shelter ID number 1, search, good, inspect, console, and now we extracted the data, and we'll see that this is what we extracted, array 7, right? We just printed this here. So it gives me this information. So what I said, item number 0, we'll call it extract data item number 0, we'll call it shelter name. Item number 1, we'll call it shelter country, right here. The name, shelter country, and so on and so on and so on. So this is our new dictionary. And now that we have a dictionary, I'm just going to remove the address because I do not want to return an address. I just want to return the other things, the address of the owner. And I'm creating a table here inside our page, and the table will create a table header with the shelter information, the shelter info, right? The keys are going to be the header values, column values, and then we'll create the rows, right? We'll go into the shelter info and we'll create the data for each cell inside the row, and then we'll return the table container. We're going to append this table container to the table container that exists on our page. If you go to table container, let's Control C, Control F, we'll see that this is right here. It's a div right under the search button, the first search button right here. Right, so it's a div right here. So this returns this table is appended to the table container. This while a function is just saying that if we already have a table here and we search again, delete this table and create a new one in there. All right, the last function is a little bit more complex. It's similar to getMyShelter, but it's getShelterList. So we're going to get multiple shelters here. Let's see. Get search undefined. First of all, we have to connect to our MetaMask wallet. Refresh. Search. Okay, in this case, we're only in the function that I'm going to show you right now, we're only displaying shelters where their at capacity is false, where they have room to get more, to receive more animals. So in our case, both shelter 2 and shelter 1 are at capacity. So let's add another shelter. Shelter 3, country India, Mumbai, zip code like that, submit, accept, perfect, ID number 3, and we'll, the capacity is false. Let's also change capacity of shelter number 2 to false as well, submit, confirm transaction. Okay, so this took about 15 seconds. Capacity updated. Now if we pull all shelters, we'll see that we get shelter 2 and 3 because they are not at capacity. They have room to receive more animals. So this is what we're doing in this function, getShelterListing. This is triggered when this button is clicked, the search button, and we're getting the provider. We do not need a signer, creating a shelter contract instance, pulling the shelter added events, right? And then we're going to console log all these events so we can actually look at what we got. See, we got all these. Let's pull it again. All these events. We got 3 different events. We got shelter 1, 2, and 3. The first shelter, the second, and the third. But we're going to filter it. We're going to pull all these events, create a table. Here I'm also, if the table doesn't exist, then I'm going to create the table ID, create the table. And then here I'm saying for the shelter of each of one of these shelters, so the first shelter, we are going to extract the shelter ID. You see args shelter ID, so args shelter ID right here. Extract it, and we're going to turn it into a number. And then we're going to call the shelter listings mapping function with the shelter ID, so we can get the shelter data. We can get the shelter struct, right? Remember, if we have the mapping here, all we have to do is put the shelter ID and we get the shelter struct with all this information. And if we have all the information of the shelter struct, now we can create this dictionary only if the shelter data at capacity is false. So here's where we're filtering it. If the at capacity of the shelter is false, then we're going to create this new shelter dictionary and you put it inside, create a header and rows and put it inside the table, but only if it's false. If it's not false, we're not going to do anything. We're going to skip it. So there you have it. We can close down. These are all the functions within the decentralized applications. There's a lot of information here, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me under the YouTube video in the comment section. I'll be more than happy to try and help. Don't forget, if you benefited from this video, click the like button, subscribe, become a member, and that's it. Always remember, we're better together, so help each other out.